Hello again, you're still here. Thank you. Thanks to the panel. They're back, most of them. Oh, all of them. Good. Okay. Okay, excellent. That's a good sign. I want to thank those of you who saw the amazing visual images from Chris Rainier, who's a National Geographic photographer and actually is here at the Walton, the Global Institute of Sustainability as a Walton Global Fellow. I don't know if Chris is in the audience anywhere, but we thank him there for his wonderful images. Okay, there were a lot of different questions. It was a really interesting set, and clearly a lot of you are concerned. What I'm going to do is I've got questions that are more or less directed to each of the panelists, so we'll start with them, and then there's some for all of us at the end. Okay, Lindy, someone was worried about what the probability is of another supervolcano. Should we be worried?
Of course we should be worried. No. So there's this popular term, supervolcano, which I think was invented by a television network. I'm serious, actually. And it's used a lot of times to apply to Yellowstone. And that's a totally different kind of volcano than the one that happened in Siberia, but it would be truly disruptive to us. Say the ones that are like the ones in Siberia might happen on a periodicity of tens of millions of years, so honestly we do not need to worry about them at all. But some of these other individual volcanoes that can cause climate change, that could be disruptive, a little bit more common, but honestly, low probability, not what we need to spend our time worrying about.
But here's a follow-up that should we be worried about this? That in what way you mentioned the similarities between climate change and what happened after the volcano. In what way specifically should we be worried? Are we really reproducing the conditions that happened after that volcano now?
Well, it's the closest thing in the geologic record in terms of chemistry and rapidity and severity. Actually, what we're doing here is much more rapid. There's a scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research who says that he thinks it's the closest analog to the present day. And so I think it is an absolutely apt cautionary tale, and all the more reason for us to pull together and make these changes.
And I think it's important to point out, as was raised, I think, at the meeting, that it's not just one. Carbon dioxide isn't, the volcano doesn't kill you, carbon dioxide itself doesn't. But there are many aspects that it changes currents and getting rid of the poles, changes water currents, changes the dredging from the deep oceans, so it's a long, complex set of...
Yeah, that's right. So here we are pretending today that science is all these answers, and all these questions have answers, and we're happy to provide them to you, but we all know that science is really just questions, and that's why we love to do it. It's just one question after the next. And so here's a great moment where we can all just take a pause and admit to ourselves that we don't understand this. We don't understand the complexity of the network of events that happens when you change the Earth's atmospheric chemistry. Things get hotter. What are some of the things that happen when it gets hotter from greenhouse gases? It changes the way the ocean atmosphere works. It kills certain kinds of animals and plants and causes others to thrive. And this network of effects is so complicated that we can't do the predictions that we need to do. And this is one of the reasons why we need to be very cautious about thinking about geoengineering, because we don't have the answers. We don't.
That's great. And I think that again, that was one of the reasons why we brought people together to try and talk about what predictive power we have and what can we do to try and learn from the past to affect the future, which is really what Origins is all about. Thank you. Svante, there were a bunch of questions for you that were similar. There were a lot, actually. You touched a nerve. But one is, well, there are two particularly similar ones that I think are interesting, which is on a lot of people's minds. Can we or should we attempt de-extinction by resurrecting the genome of extinct species like Neanderthals? And then this other one, which was kind of a plaintive question: what projects are being done for DNA archiving on libraries? Once polar bears are extinct, we'll be able to bring them back, right? So.
Well, so can we and should we bring Neanderthals back, I guess? a short answer would be no and no. In a way, I have gone around, made jokes over 10 years, I think, in talks saying, what will we do when we find a single change in a gene that we think is important for humans? We want to make transgenic chimp and put it in a chimp and make transgenic humans. And I thought it was a joke until George Church at Harvard started saying one should clone Neanderthals, which was, of course, taking it much, much further. You know, with all due respect for people that work in that field, it is still sort of way away to be able to put in my list there, right, the 30,000 changes, when we need to put them in one human embryo, all of them correct, all of them on both chromosomes and not make any mistakes. So we are way away from doing that. In addition, what I present to you there, and I say it's the whole Neanderthal genome, it's in reality just 2/3 of the genome. It's the things that occur in a single copy. The DNA we get out of the bones are, of course, short little fragments. So when we have part of the genome that's repeated, we don't know if it comes from this repeat or that repeat that's similar in sequence. And those repetitive things are also important. So it's actually impossible, technical, to do this. And on an ethical level, I think it's sort of unthinkable for a civilized society to contemplate that. We're not creating sentient human beings, which were the Neanderthals were, for scientific curiosity.
Well, that's interesting to say, because I'd be interested to hear what other people think. It seems to me, ultimately, and we talk, some people say that cloning, even cloning humans, is unethical. But it seems to me the history is that if we can do it, we will do it. So I suspect it will happen. And while it is certainly, as you pointed out, technologically difficult to resurrect Neanderthals, or maybe we could do a close approximation. And I suspect while it's technologically difficult now, it won't be N years in the future. So what's wrong? Why is it unethical do you think it really won't happen because it's unethical? Do you think there won't be researchers that will do it?
Well, of course, it's hard to say what will happen in the really long term, but I think we sort of have a consensus in our societies that we don't do this, right?
Well, I don't know.
We are not even changing the human germline to cure terrible diseases. Now one sort of considers putting in mitochondria, which is a very special part of the genome. It's not part of the really nuclear genome. But actually all countries I know of forbid this at the moment. We do gene therapy somatically, not in the germline. Yeah. But that said, you know, the polar bear question there, I think we should preserve cells from endangered animals, because if you have living cells, you can clone individuals.
But that's okay, you think?
Yes. That is sort of a very different thing.
Why?
I mean, you have the entire genome. You first of all don't have this enormous risk of making some errors with it. And polar bears are not sentient beings as humans are.
Oh, okay. Well, that's true. But they're sentient, don't you think?
Excuse me?
They're sentient, don't you think?
I mean, I think they probably don't think about their origins. And
that's probably
death
true.
As a level.
It's anyone else have any thoughts about whether that's?
I just like to watch wit versus wit. It's fun here.
Yeah.
What was that?
I like to watch wit versus wit.
Well,
Can I just toss
sure.
in that in Nottingham, England, at the Frozen Ark, they are collecting the DNA from endangered animals, actually from whole ecosystems now. I don't know that they specifically want it so that they can start over again if something goes extinct, but maybe to enrich a dwindling gene pool before that comes to pass.
I mean, we'll have to collect cells, right?
In Fort Collins, Colorado, the U.S. government is storing every quote-unquote valuable plant.
Well, not just in Colorado, but in near you in Svalbard. There's a.
Yeah.
We wanted to get someone from there to come here, but they weren't able to come. But
Right.
trying to make
Back to polar bears just for a second. So polar bears have only been the white creatures that we think of right now for about 50,000 years. they're derivative of a very large brown bear in Ireland. They've done some recent sort of connections back and forth. And so the thing that we probably should say about some of this stuff is that, as we heard earlier, is that we don't really know enough to be contemplating the notion of purposeful manipulation of a 4.5 billion year old process that's been underway where we're just beginning to grasp it. It doesn't mean that we at some point can't or won't, but I think that there's a lot of need for caution as we move forward on these kinds of things.
Yeah. May I add something here?
Sure.
Well, first of all, from the point of view of the polar bear, we're destroying their habitat. We're driving them extinct. What would we do with a polar bear if we brought it back? And on the same sort of a note with the Neanderthals, suppose we cloned a Neanderthal. How would we know how to bring it up to be a Neanderthal?
Well, I think, to me, maybe I'm
gone forever.
amoral, but it seems to me that's a fascinating question. And I'd like to, I'd be an interesting thing to do. I'd like to
answer it. Well, you shouldn't do it, right?
Okay.
But as I say, I ultimately think, I absolutely agree that the notion that we can do these things, people get the impression that we can manipulate things, and we can. We're just at the baby stages, as you point out, but we won't always be, and we will at one point have those capabilities. And I would be very surprised if, given those capabilities, some of the things that people view as terrifying don't happen. And it seems to me that we have to think about those possibilities. After all, for many people, in vitro fertilization, well, for the Catholic Church, in vitro fertilization was terrifying. And in fact, the line was that the children produced by in vitro fertilization would not have souls. And then the minute the first in vitro fertilized kid was born, that argument went out the window. So all of these concerns tend to change when things happen. So
But one of the things we have to also think about is that we're the causal factor, and other species are the causal factor in environment change, which leads to variation, which leads to evolutionary shifts, which leads to evolutionary change. We are already less consciously than we should be, less thoughtfully than we should be, creating these new species and depleting other species. And so what it is, again, is that our brain is, and our systems are, and our thinking is, and our theories are inadequate to our present role on the planet as a dominant species.
Yeah, I agree. And we would be essentially creating invasive species from another time instead of another place.
I mean, and I spent a lot of time in Australia, and trying to bring new species in with the thought that they might do something has been a recipe for disaster every time it's been tried.
Yeah, those rabbits worked out really well.
Cane tones as well is a big. Okay, let's see, Ian. Why do you think that Homo sapiens were able to dominate? What is it about our species? Is it language? Is it ability to socialize? I know it's an issue we talked a lot about today in our workshop.
Well, I think the key is our cognition that I mentioned. We're able to remake the world in our minds in a way in which no other organism seems to be able to do. That enables us to plan, to ask those what-if questions. And that makes us a uniquely formidable competitor. And I think it's borne out by the record that we have. When Homo sapiens went anywhere, the other local resident hominids disappeared. They couldn't cope with an organism that was unlike anything that had ever emerged before in the way it was able to process information in its mind. And I think that was a key. And I think language is kind of a symptom of it, although I suspect that it was the invention of language that kicked off this new way of manipulating information in our minds.
Now, so you sort of well, I don't know whether you disagree, but we had one of my colleagues, Curtis Marion, who's at the meeting, I don't know if he's here, has argued pretty forcefully that it's not just cognition per se, but it's socialization. It's the ability, it's to hyper-socialize, to create groups and go beyond your kin that made humans such effective killers, if you wish, and ultimately caused them to survive.
Yeah, I mean, Curtis makes a very good point that humans are hyper-prosocial. We are extraordinarily tolerant of each other in a sense, and we're extraordinarily patient. And that is something that is rather unusual, but I think its roots probably go back before the acquisition of the of the particular way we have of manipulating data, which is very recent. I mean, we're talking probably within the last 100,000 years or so. Curtis has information that suggests that might go back beyond that. But really, we only have totally demonstrable modern manipulation of information at about 100,000 years ago, which is well after, actually, the earliest evidence we have for humanity or Homo sapiens as an anatomical entity.
We actually, one of the first origins meetings we had was about the origin of modern humans, the origins of human uniqueness. Mm-hmm. And we brought geneticists, psychologists, economists, paleontologists, anthropologists together. And I always found it fascinating because it reminded me of that story about the blind people touching an elephant and in different places, and that everyone had a different reason that humans were unique. And it's hard to know how we'll ever know. I don't know. How will we know?
Well, you can make laundry lists of things that only humans do, ad nauseam. You can almost find something else, hang gliding, wearing lipstick, I don't know what it might be, that only humans do, that nothing else does. But these are all symptoms. These are all expressions of something that's more basic inside. And I think this great pro-sociality that we have actually comes from our being a secondary carnivore. We're the only creature that has actually become a predator in very recent times. And we did this, on the back of a frugivorous and herbivorous kind of heritage. And that particular kind of reconversion or not reconversion, but conversion to at least partly predatory way of life probably goes back a long way. And I think it's there that we have to look for the roots of our hyper-prosocial kind of behavior.
Okay. Can I add a few?
Oh, sure.
And I think not to be too sort of pessimistic from not cloning Neanderthals. There are things from a biological point of view we can do now, which, for example, involves using stem cells. So human stem cells that you can put in these mutations and actually then differentiate the cells in vitro. And you can even make sort of little mini brains now in a dish and actually study brain development, for example. So I think we will find out some about all of these things in the rather near future.
So would you be upset if we cloned a Neanderthal brain?
A mini brain.
A mini brain, as long as a little one.
Yes.
Okay.
For the 200th anniversary of Frankenstein, which is just coming up in 2018.
Let's get on that.
Okay, here's one which I couldn't see for anyone, so I thought I'd make it for me. But I think it's one everyone might want to talk about. It said, do you see artificial intelligence influencing natural extinction and or forcing our own extinction? We touched on it before. And as I say, I think it's inevitable, it seems to me. I cannot see any way in which, first of all, there's nothing that I can see that distinguishes except the mechanism of computation, digital computation, and consciousness. It's just a measure of complexity at some level. So I do think machines will become conscious, not in the term that people talk about. I think that you could show in physics-wise, I'd be surprised if it happened within a century. But I do think it'll happen. And when that's the case, I don't see how biology can compete directly once machines are self-programmable and then it seems to me they have many, many advantages. And I don't see that as a bad future either. I don't see, as you point out, I don't see it us being extinct. It's any conscious being will then want to keep up. We'll have to integrate those capabilities. And so the future, I think, is inevitably, a Borg, but not the Borg. But is machines, and I think that's fine. It doesn't bother me. I don't know.
Well, can I just insert something here, which is that we already are cyborgs to a large extent, and chimeras, many of us more than others, to a large extent. And I assume that in the future, machines will have a kind of consciousness, will have deep emotions, but there won't be human emotions.
Why?
Because they would have to be embodied exactly as we are, to be having just the same kind of thing. And so that's why I think maybe there'll be a parallel species. But if but you're suggesting that they would completely replace us.
Well,
right?
I just think it's going to be a huge advantage. And I think that, parallel the history of what we've seen about extinctions is that when a species dominates, it tends to take over. And, but I think this impression that machines, as you point out, won't be emotional is completely, I don't understand why. I mean, we have emotions because we experience empathy, we understand what's going around us, we have vast experiences, and input and output we allowed for machines. And there's a lot of discussion, and we will have, by the way, a meeting on artificial intelligence here in the next year or two that Elon Musk has funded for us, and it ought to be interesting. But there's a large concern about that, but I'm not personally as concerned. And in particular, I get excited. I see my friend Frank Wilczek's in the audience who's visiting us. He's a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, and I often say this, but I usually don't give him attribution, but today I will, that I'm fascinated by how they will think, and what their emotions may not be human, but in particular, when they do physics, will they do the same kind of physics? Will they think the same questions are interesting? I just think that's amazing to think about.
Yeah, I guess, just apropos of Frankenstein, we should remember that the real sin there was not in the creation of the monster, it was in abandoning the monster, according to Mary Shelley.
Yeah, and the destruction of the monster because it was perceived to be evil when in fact it wasn't, right?
And of
So
course,
we'll see,
that was
I guess,
inspired by a volcano, I'll add. Yeah.
I missed that.
Frankenstein inspired by a volcano. Who could write the most depressing story? Diane, I'm really interested to hear more about what you mean by non-human emotions. Those of us who've worked a lot with horses and dogs, for example, I think that we would fairly uniformly say that they have the same kinds of varieties of emotions that humans do. And so how would machine emotions be different?
I can't really tell you the answer to that. I'm only reporting from a roboticist, friend of mine, who is a pioneer in evolutionary robotics. And that is his goal, to create self-creating, evolving, alternate life forms.
Well, we'll see. I must say, I have a lot of my friends who are mathematicians, so I know about non-human emotions. But okay, let's go on. Let's go on to Diane. Actually, there are two questions I thought might be good for you. One of them in particular is, given your book about the senses, the question says, how do you think our senses are evolving with or because of technology?
I think yes. is the answer to that. On the one hand, we're adding a lot of extensions to our senses, so we're living in sensory overload a lot of the time, but we're also living in sensory deprivation because we're spending so much of our lives not outside experiencing what is happening all around us with all of our senses, but instead featuring maybe the visual sense over the other senses. I was talking just a little bit about that. I think it's going to be increasingly more important for us as we become more technologically adroit to spend an equal amount of time out in nature, because that is the only way that we can really understand the world is through our senses. And I don't think we want to lose the range of motion in our senses that we have. We get so much information from them.
Actually, I was hoping you'd say that because we were talking about that backstage, because the next question is it's to the panel, but I thought you might want to start on it. How do we engage, and it's from one of actually our members of our workshop, how do we engage it says undeserved, but I don't think how do we get, forget that word. How do we engage, underserved, I get it, okay. How do we engage underserved youth in biodiversity conservation when many are faced with no exposure to nature? It's an interesting question.
Well, they're not, most often, they're not exposed to know nature, but maybe it would be, if I'm understanding you correctly, digitalized nature, right? Pixelated nature, which is a very different critter than, just being able to turn all the way around and be distracted by something that's off camera, for example, and just find out what happens next, because there's always something fascinating next that happens in nature.
So how do we engage them? I mean, this is a big question about biodiversity. I mean, in planetary science and What can we do to get, because someone was pointing out during our meeting, I think, that when they do studies of concern about biodiversity, it's very age-specific. That the people who are involved in the Nature Conservancy, in fact, are generically 65 years of age and older. That young people are not as concerned about biodiversity because many of them just don't have the experience.
Well, you know, Michael was talking about a project that you had in Iowa.
Yeah, when I was in college, right?
Right. Go out and look at a square.
There's a square meter of rhizosphere, that is soil with grass. It was in a prairie, a natural prairie that had been unaltered, and our assignment for 1 year was to evaluate everything within that 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter.
And I've actually heard of that happening, being assigned in lots of other places too. Just look and see what is dependent on other things, how they interact. Just go out and spend some time looking at nature.
So maybe Neil's Fab Labs have to add a component of,
I'm afraid
of going
so.
out into the backyard as well as making it.
One of the things that we were talking about in there is that I was at whale camp in Patagonia, and believe it or not, you can go there as a visitor. And whales get sunburned and then they shed their skin the same way that we do, but on a big scale. And the researchers gathered the skin, they do DNA studies. So now you learn a lot being in the water beside a mother whale with a baby. You learn so much about behavior and so on. But now they've changed that, and they have drones that will swoop down low and collect the DNA sample from when the whale blows, which is certainly more efficient. But think about how much is lost also. So, I mean, that's a rather distant thing for people to do, but the same is true in the backyard.
Okay, I think kids should go in the backyard more.
May I add just one thing here? The people have been really worried about this isolation from nature for a very long time. I work at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, and my favorite exhibit, or one of my favorite exhibits there, was actually built, I think, back in the 1920s. It's an exhibit on the natural history of New York State, very close by to the city, and it was built because the powers that be at the museum at that time were worried that city kids could not get out and interact with nature and experience it and see it, and they felt they had to represent it in the museum. And nearly 100 years now down the line, we're still worrying about the same thing, and we will presumably continue.
Okay, we'll turn to Michael. There's two questions here. One is, with the extinction of modern education and learning, the 50% of universities, will the idea of it being necessary to have a college diploma die with that?
The notion of a college diploma is an indication of a person having completed a particular pathway. It's nothing more or nothing less at the moment. The notion of somehow being able to say that you went through learning experience A or B is probably going to continue, but not as the only way in which you can express that. So it's likely that if you have a digital identity that's reflective of your learning capacity and your adaptive learning skills, that if you can present that with an identity record associated with you, and that's readable by someone else, that would work. And so the notion of a college diploma, would it go away? No. Would it become one of an array of mechanisms by which a human has the ability to project their learning capacity? Probably.
There's another one, I think it must have been written by a colleague, because it says, are educators, teachers, professors facing extinction? They want to know that from you.
In what I said, it was just the opposite of that. It was the notion of the empowerment of educators and teachers away from the notion of factory floor workers, where they sit on a factory floor and project something out to a almost Foucaultian controlled audience, which is completely shaped by the technology of the learning experience. If one can free the teacher or the professor from that constraint and can empower that professor to be a master of creative expression and the creation of the curation of vast amounts of knowledge or information, and find a way to engage students across the spectrum of their learning abilities and their types of intelligence, it'll be a whole new era for teachers and professors, a whole new way to engage. And this notion of holding on to these past methods are largely driven by tradition and ego.
Can I pitch in something here? How about not allowing students to go from high school directly to college? I mentioned this in workshop earlier. How about a kind of Vista Core that is focused on the environment, so that they are obliged for a year to go out and work for the environment or in humanitarian projects, and then maybe have part of their education paid for?
Yeah, so in 1974, which was eons ago, in 1975, I was a Vista volunteer in a special program called University Year for Action. And it was a program where you attended college, switched to independent studies, and then worked in the field. Yeah. And I worked on environmental projects in Iowa, Wyoming, and Kentucky. And so we got to travel in all of those places, work on all of those things, and those kinds of programs don't exist anymore. So the answer would be, are there alternative ways to intensify learning, to expand learning, to improve and enhance it? Unbelievable ways, and we should be looking at all of them.
Okay, great. Okay, now, I'll applaud that. We're coming close to the end of the evening. There are two questions that I think are worth asking the whole panel, and hopefully we can be brief, because they're rather deep questions, I think. So let me just run through and get some quick answers from people to these. First, given we are co-evolving with society, which is resulting in humans both interacting at a distance and killing at a distance, should we be optimistic about the future?
So killing at a distance, by the way, was one of our most important characteristics. We're one of the only organisms that we ever have known of that has the ability to project force. Yeah. That projection of force has allowed us to build communities and protect them, has allowed us to acquire food, to use food, to establish ideas, to protect those ideas, to defend those ideas, to have one idea supplant another idea, to defeat evil ideas. All of those things are a function of projection and killing. So is it likely to continue to be a characteristic of human beings? Yes.
In fact, absolutely. In fact, actually, again, Curtis Marion, there's a wonderful cover story, I think, in Nature, that the research they did about, I mean, the ability to project a killing tool goes back extremely, very efficiently project what are essentially arrows that are designed to not just pierce an animal, but to make sure it bleeds and you don't have to run after it all day long, which may sound mean, but that's life. Go back well beyond 50,000 years, maybe even Neanderthals.
In Sitka, Alaska, I visited a museum there once where I saw dozens of arrowheads, but they were basically spearheads, each one designed to take out an individual bird, a different kind of bird, optimized for that particular bird. Those birds were probably very likely to the survival of those indigenous peoples.
So we've established that we're killers at a distance. So should we be optimistic?
Yes, we should absolutely be optimistic. We have to be optimistic because there isn't any option. Because if you're not optimistic, you might as well give up right now, because that's the alternative to optimism. But I think also we've traditionally been a little bit slow learning in terms of understanding our technologies and dealing with it. And a good example is mine safety. That there were many, many horrible deaths in mines before legislation and a notion of what mine safety should be caught up. It takes decades. And I think that every time we go through a technological transformation, we have to wait for society to catch up with how we want to handle it. And I think this is another example. We're not falling off the cliff all of a sudden. This is another step on our ladder of development technologically.
Okay. Well, we're also not just killers. We're also capable of extraordinary acts of mercy and heroism and humanitarian things and so on, also at a distance now, more and more.
Mm-hmm. So you're optimistic?
Yes, I hope I'm realistic and optimistic.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think that we're optimized to be any particular kind of creature, and I think that the chance events are probably going to have an extremely important influence on our future. And I don't think nobody can, obviously, if they're chance, nobody can predict where we're going. But I would have to agree with Lindy and say, look, you might as well be optimistic, because there really isn't any other alternative under which you can live the kind of life that we all would wish to have.
Okay, that's an upbeat way to almost go. Now to take that down a notch. Maybe. The last question, which I think is a very deep question, is if extinction is a part of natural evolution, is losing a species like the polar bear a bad thing?
No.
You want to comment?
A bad thing.
To lose a single species like the polar bear?
Yeah.
So how many bear subspecies are there? There's a lot. How many rattlesnake species are there? So is it in and of itself bad to lose a single species? The answer is no. Is it bad to lose a single species because of some stupid thing we did? Now that's a different question.
Yeah. What do you mean stupid thing?
We delivered chemicals from Southeast Asia into the food supply chain that caused the polar bears to somehow become chemically afflicted. In a sense, they were not engaged in a natural environment, but a greatly globally altered environment that we thoughtlessly provided to them.
So ultimately, I think we are going to lose the polar bears, and we are going to live in a planet that is the planet is changing, and there's nothing much we can do about it at this time except stop it from changing more extremely. But we are experiencing climate change, and even if we turned off every bit of carbon production, that carbon would exist in the atmosphere for 1,000 years, and so there will be global warming, and we will lose a lot of the ice caps, and I suspect we will lose the polar bears. And the question is, what do we do about that?
Well, we just try to be conservative, right?
Yeah.
We should sort
Or
of
do we just say we
Well, I think
adapt
these
to a world that's
individual
different?
species are kind of emblematic of a larger of a larger issue. I mean, this is really a matter of scale. Yeah, species are originating and becoming extinct routinely over time, but there are moments at which we can, in the past, identify absolute total decimation of biodiversity in nature, and it's happened on numerous occasions. We talk about really 5 major occasions in the past, but there have been many others. And now we're looking at what's potentially another one. And the big difference in this case is that we can trace this to our own activities. The other mass extinction have occurred because of major perturbations produced in nature by natural events. And in this case, our activities appear to be the agency, and that, I think, puts a very different slant on things.
Well, we also are not independent of nature, so that it won't be just polar bears. Human societies, there are going to be severe traumas when 1 billion or 2 billion or 3 billion people are displaced. It doesn't just mean they lose their homes. There's socio-political and security implications, and in fact, among the groups in this country who are most actively investigating climate change is our national defense industry, which realizes it's a huge security issue. So I think the question would be, it would be tragic to lose polar bears if it represents that we're taking a planet where it is miserable to live in for humans, for most humans on the planet. And so I think we have to do what we can to, having lost the polar bear, to make sure that we don't lose ourselves or our society.
This has to be, and it has to be a societal action. I think that's really where the difficulty is. Isn't it the deepest of ironies that the defense industry is looking into this very deeply, understanding perfectly what's happening on Earth, and yet the legislature can't take action and they're still in denial?
Yeah.
It's a huge answer.
Which takes me to pointing out that this was a wonderful panel. One of the things that's wonderful about this kind of discussion about such important deep issues, which are also moral issues, is first of all, morality, as we've had discussed at one of our earlier symposia, has to be informed, and it's informed by knowledge about how things work. You can't decide what actions are right or wrong if you don't know the implications of those actions. And that's one of the reasons to discuss this, so we can decide how to act. There's a famous statement that fortune favors the prepared mind. And these are deep questions which have clearly aroused your interest. And one of the purposes of Origins, of the Origins Project, is not just to understand our origins, but to understand our origins so we can impact upon the future. And I want to thank this panel for helping inform us and getting us thinking about the future so we can all try and make the world a better place. Thank you very much. Thank you.